Well, Melissa, thanks for joining the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time. Super grateful for you to come here and share your own message and some of the work you're doing. We've touched on some of the things around the area of therapy you're doing, but we'll get into that. Obviously, I just wanted to give you an opportunity, first of all, to introduce yourself and some of the work you're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. Love being on a podcast. I've not done this before, so this is great experience for me. Um, my name's Melissa, and I am a therapist here in the UK. I predominantly work with young people, particularly young people of divorced parents. And my journey kind of started when I was 12 years old. My dad left the family home. It was his choice, and we had a okay relationship. I saw him on weekends and sort of in the week, that kind of thing. But my dad is an alcoholic,
Hmm.
so that was quite challenging to manage. And it wasn't until my early 20s actually that I accepted him being an alcoholic. um, I suppose as a child it was quite normalized, I didn't recognize it, but our relationship became quite difficult when I was about 18, 19, and he made the decision to end our relationship. So he's still alive, but I haven't seen him for about 10 years. So it's kind of really drawn me to the absence of fathers
Hmm.
in people's lives. But it's worth noting that I am, a daughter who doesn't have a father in her life, but I am also a therapist. And when I put that kind of hat on, I have to think to myself that, my dad's an alcoholic, there's some form of mental health going on there. And I'm often torn between kind of the two sides to me, which kind of draws me into like men's mental health and kind of what's going on for men, because it seems to be quite a common pattern that's evolving,
Hmm.
in society. I don't know if that, it's the same for in Canada or the wider world, but certainly in the UK, absent fathers is quite a common thing to happen.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where it's brought me to, really. Working with people whose dads have left. But I
Hmm.
guess I have a stopping point, because men tend not to want to work with me, whether that's because I'm female, I'm young, I'm not relatable. Um, but certainly for me, it's something that I would like to work with. There are boundaries there because there is what we call transference,
Hmm.
where men can trigger certain things in me, but I'm quite aware of that. So I'd be able to assess the situation before I agree to work with someone.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important to mention the transference because that is, as a therapist, it's an important thing to be aware of. But we often get that trigger in our day-to-day lives, right? People say things to trigger a reaction in us, and we don't often know why we are reacting. I guess for listeners, like I know I've had a lot of guests from the UK on this podcast. Where exactly in the UK are you based?
So I am in the southern part of the UK, an area called Southampton.
Hmm.
Um, it's quite a small city, but yeah, it's quite
Hmm.
well populated, I guess.
Yeah,
Maybe not compared to Canada or the USA, but
yeah,
there's certainly a lot of people here.
yeah.
Uh, and the demographics of the population are very different within Southampton,
Hmm.
between sort of the poorer sides and the richer sides, as of everywhere.
Yeah.
And I talk about demographics purely because I look into research into why absent fathers becomes so apparent, and demographics does seem to come into it. As much as I hate working with statistics and I hate labeling anything,
Hmm.
um, I always do fall back to the research because it's factual information and it gives me what I'm looking for.
Of course. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the research does represent something, and I guess the reason why I asked is, and as I mentioned, I've had many people come on this podcast that are based in the UK, and based on the conversations I've had, it sounds like there is a bit more advancement in terms of the conversations that are taking place when it comes to men's mental health. It sounds like the UK is a little bit more advanced than some of the other places, especially in Canada. We are starting to talk about it more, but it's almost still like in its infancy in a way. Like there is more conversation around men's mental health and the 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 societal pressures that men face in terms of keeping things in a box or closed up and not sharing it. So I think it's a really important topic to discuss, especially in the world we're living in right now with the pandemic, where there's potential for additional pressures. And I know you mentioned demographics, because in most cases, still in a lot of households, the men are expected to kind of provide for the family. And
Yeah,
right now, with the pandemic, there's additional stressors around job security, being at home, taking care of kids when you're not used to it.
yeah.
So there's a lot going on, and I think we really need to encourage everyone to speak up, uh, obviously in a healthy way, but really start talking about some of the struggles. So I guess in the work you've been doing, what have you been noticing, and like what are some of the challenges men face when it comes to their mental health?
So you're exactly right. Men's mental health is huge in the UK at the moment, and it is getting a lot of, I suppose, coverage in the media about men speaking up about how they're feeling. And I'm definitely on board with that, and would encourage any man to kind of speak up.
Hmm.
When they're feeling low or whatever that may be, it's okay to share that information. In Britain, it is very much about the stiff upper lip, and I think that does go part and parcel into, certainly in the UK, about men, not talking about their mental health, because you're right, we call them kind of the breadwinners over here, and they're the ones that have to bring all of the money in and support their family. And I think that's something that's quite huge for men, and I think it's very much a generational thing.
Hmm.
Sort of past generations, it was very much about the man going out, doing their hard stay graft and coming back and having to help the wife with their kids, and that kind of thing. But that's changing now, and women are, going to work, and men are staying home and looking after the children. So that's kind of completely flipped it round. But the interesting thing is about feminism and the
Hmm.
rise in feminism. And whilst I'm a female myself and I'm all about girl power, there is an element of it becoming a bit unbalanced, and men feeling like they're not able to speak up because
Hmm.
they may be perceived as not allowing a female to sort of explore her emotions or what's going on for her. So sometimes I feel like men get a little bit lost in
Hmm.
that or forgotten. And we're supposed to be encouraging them to speak up, but
Hmm.
also encouraging females to speak up. And it's getting that kind of balance right.
Hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. And I guess you mentioned something around having the challenges of men being able to open up to you. And if I was being completely honest, 5 or 6 years ago, if I was seeing a female therapist, I would struggle to be able to open up too. It's only through the work I've done that I'm a lot more comfortable having those conversations, but not everyone's there yet. So what are some things you do to enable some of the clients you may have to be able to share, or what are some things that other therapists can do to help men be more vulnerable or just open to sharing?
So, working with men, particularly men my own age, I very much pick up on, or at least keep in the back of my mind, who I am to them, whether I'm being perceived as their mother,
Hmm.
their daughter, their sister, their wife,
Hmm.
whoever that female, figure is in their life. There can be, it goes back to that transference.
Hmm.
It's who I am for them. So I often try and pick up on that, and keep it on the back burner or the back seat, if you like. So throughout our sessions, I'm just aware of it. And if it does come up, then obviously I'll bring it in to the session to kind of explore those relationships. So they can just get a bit more self-awareness around how it's impacting them.
Hmm.
The other thing is about emotions. I often find sometimes men can't identify, what exactly they're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
They, get told about, about anxiety and about anger and about sadness, but what does it actually feel like? And it's connecting those physical sensations to that labeled emotion. So, for example, with anxiety, it's about recognizing that it can give you sweaty palms and the butterfly feelings in your stomach and
Mm-hmm.
a dry mouth. And those physical symptoms can really connect with that feeling, that label, which can help them identify what's coming up for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's giving them time to process that. So if they're hyper aroused, which is often about talking really quickly, not pausing for a breath, it's slowing them down and getting them to take a pause so they can really feel what's going on for them in that moment, which can then allow them to take that into the outside of our sessions and practice that in their everyday relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and those are all useful tips. I guess probably a more challenging question. So how do you, so I know we talked about like the counter transference from a therapist perspective, and you said you're mindful of that. So in the event you feel like something your client is saying is triggering something in you, how are you able to hold yourself accountable and kind of in that moment be able to not react? And I guess for me, I'm curious because as an aspiring therapist, those are things I would need to work on as well myself in the future.
I think just being aware of it, it is a massive challenge for me, and I'm not going to deny that. I tend to avoid working with, particularly older men, if especially if they've got an alcohol problem. It's just something I know I will find really hard,
Hmm.
and I'm okay with saying that because I'm human, and everybody's got their own thing going on. But in the moment, for me, if something comes up, I often in my mind physically see myself picking it up and putting it to the side, and having that visualization in my head reminds myself of where I am, like in the moment. I'm a Gestalt therapist, so I call it in the here and now. um, and kind of just trying to connect with them by physically parking that to the side. And my supervisor is amazing. I always give her a call if something's troubling me, or
Hmm.
I'm worried about something, and she often calms me down or reassures me that I'm doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think that that is also important in our day-to-day lives because there are things that, people we're in relationships with, whether it's our friends or our partners, they're going to say something that may trigger something inside of us. And being aware of it in the moment, as hard as it can be, is an
Mm-hmm.
important quality to have. And I think that can apply to even our relationships with our parents or our children. Um, so I guess, you know, going back to the conversation you had about your father, your own experience, and the whole concept of absent fathers,
Mm-hmm.
like I wanted to delve into that a little bit. And as I've mentioned to you, for me, it's relatable because I'm a single father,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, I've obviously tried to stay in my child's life, but it is difficult at times because you're sharing that time or you're getting weekends and it is difficult. So it's finding that right balance because you also want to consider what's in the best interest of the child. And,
Mm-hmm.
as it is important to get that time with each parent, but sometimes it's not always the best thing for the child and being mindful of that. So from kind of looking at it from both perspectives, what are your thoughts and some of the work you've done in that field? What are some things you can share?
So, as a daughter, I know how important it is to have a dad in your life. I could have easily have gone out and, been a therapist that completely slated absent fathers and fathers that choose not to be in their child's life. But if anything, I recognise the importance of it because he's not in my life.
Hmm.
Dads are there to, teach their children about risk and get them to see the world differently and build those relationships with men, regardless of whether they're a boy or a girl. And as a daughter, I kind of missed out on that and had to figure out that for myself because he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't really there, or what he brought to my life was quite toxic.
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing is to never compare yourself to anyone. I certainly don't. I know that there's lots of daughters out there that have got absent fathers, but I know that their relationships will be very different to the ones that I have with my dad. I think the uniqueness of the relationship that I have with my dad is that I have seen him. He's walked past me in the street and he knows exactly who I am because he makes eye contact with me, but he chooses not to speak to me. So it's sometimes like seeing a walking ghost,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite a bizarre experience. And not everyone will have that in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whether that's through distance or how they handle it will always be individual. Um, when I was a child, I just wanted a relationship with my dad. That's all I wanted. I didn't care what that looked like. I didn't care how much money he spent. I just wanted his time. That was it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to me, I feel like that's more invaluable than anything else. But as a therapist, I work with a lot of young people whose parents aren't together. And again, it always goes back to them just wanting to spend that quality time with their father. And the one thing that always comes up is they desperately want their parents back together. Uh, but it's reassuring them that it's okay to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's never, well, I'd say never, but it's likely that's never going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's about building the bridge between both parents so it doesn't feel so big.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they feel like they're able to transition from mum and dad a lot smoother than they were at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think some of the work I've done, whether it's talking to other people, because I've also have a lot of friends whose parents had separated, and they've given me a lot of advice from their perspective, which has been helpful. I think as parents, where you're separated and you're sharing children, one of the biggest things to be mindful of is not ever, well, I don't want to say ever, but being mindful of not putting pressure on the children to ever choose between either parent or making them feel guilty for wanting to spend time with one of the parents. Because there's going to be times where, even my son, he may just want to hang out with me for whatever reason. And, just being mindful that you either don't take advantage of that or make uh, that child feel guilty for that, because then they're feeling that pressure of having to choose. And most of my friends have given me the advice that they do hold resentment for their parents when they grow up because they felt like they had to choose. Yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
That's exactly right. Working with young people, they often say that they would hate to have to choose,
Hmm.
even when you're giving them the scenario of kind of which house are you more comfortable in, and they even find difficulty in telling me to begin with because it's almost like they're telling their parent that they're in the room with them when they're talking about it. It's that real for them.
Hmm.
Um, and it always goes back to not wanting to upset either of them. It's being felt like they're in the middle and they're being pulled in both directions. So
Hmm.
you're exactly right. It's not putting pressure on that child. And if they want to spend time, with one parent and not the other, it's going to change. It will always ebb and flow as feelings do. And
Hmm.
there may be no real reason as to why they do that. It's just something that they want to do, and it's respecting their own boundaries really, as much as they're trying to understand yours at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, and I think again for me it's important in that sense, because again we on one end we talk about absent fathers, and on the other end, for me, like someone who's trying to be present in his son's life, I think it's, as I mentioned, finding that balance of, okay, well, I don't want, if he tells me he doesn't want to come see me on a weekend, for example, it's being mindful of not putting that pressure on him, because as much as I'm like, okay, well, it's important for him to spend time with his father and have that relationship, and I want to see him, at the same time it's finding that balance of, okay, what's the best for him in this given moment. And like you said, it does change from time to time, but I think as parents we also have to be, and again, it's maybe the concept of transference, but being mindful of our egos, and
Mm-hmm.
take not taking it personally, because, and for me the biggest thing I've tried to focus on is treat my son as not as a child when it comes to stuff like that, and telling him what he needs to do or what he should do or what's important for him. It's treating him like as an individual, and
Mm-hmm.
giving him the freedom to make choices and have an opinion. And I just want to make sure other parents are mindful of that, because I think it is important. And again, I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, completely. And you know, depending on the child's age, I often work with sort of 11 upwards. So, you know, below that age, I'm sure it may be very different, but
Hmm.
certainly for the teenage kind of category, or 11 years in and above, they're at that age where they're classed as a child, but they also know what they want at that moment in time. And it is about respecting that within them. And, you know, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and about reaching that self actualization, for
Hmm.
them, when parents split, their basic need kind of gets whipped out from underneath them. You know, that security of a home, and that love and food and all of that kind of comes into it, because financially, when parents divorce, there is that element that comes into it. And the child does worry about, are they going to stay in the same house? Are they going to have to move? There's so much going on for them in that moment. It is about being patient with them, and respecting them as an individual, like you say. And it is difficult because, like you mentioned, you have to kind of put your ego aside
Hmm.
and recognize that they are another human being that's being impacted by that choice that
Hmm.
both of you have decided to make, or one or the other.
Yeah.
um, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one of the things that that have worked for me, or I hope it's working, but you're not going to get it right
No.
100% of the time. And there's times where I do feel like I say things or do things where I've let my ego get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's being, again, recognizing that and then having that conversation with my son. So if I've let my ego make a choice and I've reacted in, whether it's anger or sadness, I always kind of take that moment to come back to him and be like, hey, you know what? I'm sorry. I made a mistake and I've learned from this. And again, you're treating the child as an individual, where you're giving them that apology. And for them, they feel comfortable that, my parent is being vulnerable and they're accepting their mistake. And it's
Yeah.
come to the point now where, my son, he's 7.5, but he's comfortable enough pointing it out in me, where he'll call me out. And
Yeah.
I appreciate that, because I've enabled that for him, that he should feel comfortable pointing it out in me or calling me out, so I can recognize it and apologize.
And that is huge, and that is incredible, actually, in modeling a great relationship there. Because you're right, humans aren't perfect. I'm not perfect.
Hmm.
None of us are, and we all have flaws. We're never going to get things right. And as a parent, if you're able to kind of show them that, I'm capable of owning up to when I've got things wrong, and when I've done things to you that wasn't okay, it just gives them permission to recognize that they can be vulnerable and
Hmm.
feel safe with other people when they're like that, and know when to leave that person when it's not safe. You're teaching them all of those great skills that they're going to need later in life. And I think that's an amazing relationship that you've got there with your son, with everything that you're doing.
Hmm. Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, I think going back to some of the things you were talking about, and I guess maybe something on a personal note for you, um, obviously, you've realized that the fact that your father doesn't want to have a relationship with you has nothing to do with you. It's
Mm-hmm.
more his own thing, right? Like, I mean, you almost, in any situation when someone treats you a certain way, you almost need to step out of it, as hard as it can be, but have compassion for that person, in a sense that it must be so difficult. Like, to be able to walk past your child and not acknowledge them, like, you must be really suffering to be not to not be able to do that. And you know,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, that it took you many years to get to that realization. But I guess what I want to understand is, when did you get to that realization, and how did you get there?
So I've had probably about 6 years of therapy, many different therapists.
Mm-hmm.
And my last one was a male. And I purposely chose a male therapist because I needed to have or build a relationship with a man, because I hadn't done so. I've had boyfriends and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd never had an older man relationship. And it impacted me in weird ways, like with my manager at work before I even started my counselling journey. And I know the counselling, diploma and the qualifications that I've got has obviously helped me a long way into the space that I'm in today. But for me, it was very much about therapy. That's the only thing that got me to recognise that, yes, he does actually have mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's also important to recognise that there is still the daughter in me, because if I don't validate those feelings, then I'm not validating the pain and the suffering that other children are going through with their
Mm-hmm.
absent father. And I've seen my dad many times face to face, and he's walked past me and not spoken to me, and that's tough. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to deny that. Um, I disassociate quite a lot when I go past him, but I think that's just a protective thing that I've put in place. But I do recognise that he has got mental health, but he never admitted that to me, and has never been vulnerable with me.
Mm-hmm.
So what you've done with your son, my dad didn't do that. It took me years to figure that out myself. But had he been open and honest from the start, I often wonder kind of where our relationship would actually be today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And and again, I think it's hard to be able to kind of disassociate yourself, because at the end of the day, you're still his daughter. But it's more, again, it's not a reflection on you. It's more a reflection on him, in terms of he's not there yet, or he hasn't been able to be vulnerable, to be able to recognize those things. And he may never, right? But
Uh-huh.
I guess along those lines, like, how do you deal with that, and what kind of advice do you have for other people who are who so badly want their parents in their lives, or whether it's one parent or both, but they can't? uh yeah, like, how do you do that?
For me, it took me a long time again to discover that what I was going through was grief, because
Mm-hmm.
there's no, although I don't like working with labels, sometimes I do find them helpful. For me, it was grief and trauma that I had been through. And, being just knowing those labels helped me kind of delve into, readings and books and things on what people go through when they're grieving and when they're going through trauma. And it helped me understand myself a bit better.
Mm-hmm.
That was really useful. And the pain that I feel for my dad is never going to go away. It's the same with grief. I always kind of look at it as a box, and inside that box is my grief, and it's a ball, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a button in the box, and every time I shake it, that ball sometimes hits that button for me. And
Mm-hmm.
that could be the pain that I'm feeling for, the loss of my dad, or it could be the triggers that I have when I'm interacting with men. But that ball does get smaller over time. So when you shake the box, it doesn't hit that button as much. And being able to understand and remember that also does help me. I'm never going to have a relationship with him. I know that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've kind of just accepted it. And this is going to sound really weird, but I actually work in bereavement care at
Mm-hmm.
sort of a large acute hospital. The reason I got into that job, I think unconsciously, is because I was waiting for my dad to kind of die and appear on, the records as deceased. And sometimes I feel like I'm in that job just waiting for his name to come through, because it feels like it would actually be easier for him to die than to talk about him not wanting to be in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It feels more socially acceptable. So for him to die would actually make my life easier. And that sounds awful, but
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the realness of being a fatherless daughter.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it is hard, right? And I know, like you said, it does sound awful, but I mean, if you were to break it down, it's, you've got this person in your life who exists, but they're basically, you know, no better than being dead, right? Like essentially they're
Yeah,
not alive, right? From your
exactly.
perspective. So, I mean, I understand that. And it must be difficult. And I guess, along the lines of like, being able to, like you said, you've accepted it. It is like grief. Um, you know, I guess for other people, because there's situations where, you may even have a relationship with your parents or one
Hmm.
parent, and they still may not be present.
Yeah.
And how do people deal with something like that, where, like, you have a relationship with your parents, but they're just not present in your life? They're just preoccupied with maybe whether it's other siblings or other things, and they're just not present, or they just don't know anything that goes on in your life, which is almost like the same thing, I would say.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
kind
I
of
don't know. Yeah.
it being emotionally unavailable is
Hmm.
kind of what I'd refer that
Yeah.
to. And that does happen as well. For me, it's about exploring kind of their pain and actually validating that pain that they're feeling, that they're not being recognized. And what I often comes up for me is about being the invisible child, and not being seen or heard. And then you can kind of go into people pleasing, sort of mannerisms and ways of being in everyday life, because sometimes people pleasing is what gets you the attention, and
Hmm.
that's quite common, in that kind of situation. They call it fawning. It's actually a trauma response, because it can be traumatic,
Hmm.
for a parent not to receive that emotional, availability. So it's, for me, it's about recognizing, actually really hearing that pain that they're going through. It's also about building up their resilience, and recognizing that they are their own person and they can control how they react to their parent, but they can't control how their parent is going to be towards them. So
Hmm.
if the parent is just going to choose to be emotionally unavailable because they don't want to see, or they just don't understand how they're being, it's really about that person finding a way to deal with that. And sometimes it is about separating them off, and seeing them as an individual and not part of their parents.
Hmm. Hmm. No, and that's really helpful, because I mean, I think that's equally important in a way, because there are situations like that, right? And um, more often the parents aren't emotionally available, as you mentioned, and just being mindful of that, but also, recognizing that and not repeating those patterns for our children, right?
Yeah,
So recognizing how difficult it was, um, and it doesn't give you the free for all to repeat that behavior or those behaviors for your children, right? So learning
yeah,
from
and it,
that.
and it really highlights the importance of validating their pain, so those patterns don't go on to kind of repeat themselves.
Hmm.
And there's always a little bit of a taboo with children, separating themselves from their parents. And I suppose there is a bit, it's the same with parents separating themselves from their children. It goes both ways, but children get older and they become adults. And then when they're an adult, they have a choice and they don't have to be in that parent's life. No matter how difficult it is, they still have that choice. And everybody has choices. It's just kind of what they would want to do with that.
Hmm.
And some people forget that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I think that definitely makes sense. I guess in terms of like the whole area of work you're doing, and with especially with absent fathers, what are some of the other things you're doing, and what's kind of on the horizon for the future, um, and what kind of like ideas you can share with people that are kind of in a similar situation as yours and that are struggling. Like, yeah.
I think talk to people, whether it's your friend, a family member that you trust, a teacher at school, a colleague, whoever that may be. I suppose just starting that conversation, if you've never done it before, is kind of opening that Pandora's box. But
Hmm.
it's really about taking baby steps. You don't have to jump into therapy straight away if that's not right for you. I know therapy is quite normalized now.
Hmm.
Um, but just having those small conversations with people is quite valuable, really. On the horizon, I don't have a clear plan. I'm definitely starting to unpick,
Hmm.
little bits about men's mental health and about kind of where this all started, really.
Hmm.
Certainly from a generational point of view, but also, men actually becoming fathers. Like, was it their choice? Of course, again, it goes back to choice. They always have a choice, but sometimes they land themselves in situations, and paternal mental health is quite important to me.
Hmm.
So I think going back to the beginning um, is a good place to start.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think, I mean, you touched on one thing that's important, because there's often the whole concept of choice, right? And sometimes, whether it's men or women, they don't have a choice, of becoming a parent, and they almost have to take on that responsibility, and they may not be ready. So there is
Mm-hmm.
that aspect of it. There's the additional aspect, which I don't know if that's something you've covered, is having the choice and then taking on that role, but realizing you weren't actually ready. And
Uh-huh.
that, I'm sure, has its own mental health implications.
Yeah, and also again the taboo around it, the people cringing a bit, I suppose, with the fact that, did you just say that
Hmm.
you had a child and you weren't ready for a child? When actually that is the reality of life. Some people have children and they're like, I wasn't ready for this,
Hmm.
and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Hmm.
You have a choice of how you deal with that, whether you want to explore the emotion or not. It's just a
Hmm.
being open and honest about how you feel with
Hmm.
people that you trust.
Yeah, and I think, again, to normalize this conversation, it is, I mean, let's be real, like, I mean, having a baby, like, I've gone through it, like, having a newborn in your family or your home is stressful. And
Mm-hmm.
if, like, losing your job, or uh, like, or any other form of stress in your life, if you can talk about it and seek therapy, childbirth is very similar. It is a stressful situation. Your sleeping patterns change, your
Uh-huh.
lifestyle changes, your relationships change, everything changes. It is, I mean, as again, it's how you frame it. Obviously, having a child come into your life is a blessing, but at the same time, it does create stress, and there's nothing wrong with admitting that and taking ownership. But you're right, there is that taboo around it, or shaming, in terms of, well,
Mm-hmm.
you know and everyone's experience is different too. Like, some people have a positive experience, or some people don't have such a difficulty with a newborn, and others have far more difficulties. So it's understanding and being aware that everyone's situation is different, and not to pass judgment in those cases.
Yeah, and parenting has become a bit glamorized, as particularly on social media or on TV. It's, it looks all wonderful with the child in the picture, and
Hmm.
but you don't really get to see, behind what that really looks like until you're in that situation. And then you think, well, this doesn't match up to what I've seen on
Hmm.
social media, and then it makes you feel like you're not allowed to feel that way. And I know it is starting to be more normalized, but for me, it's just about keeping things simple,
Hmm.
um, and just starting off by having those basic conversations and kind of seeing where it goes from there, really.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's very important, and I think having conversations like this definitely helps. It's helped me. I'm sure people listening, it will help them. But
Mhm.
again, it's just being aware of some of the challenges you may have, and just being able to openly speak about it. And I think that's kind of the underlying theme with men's mental health as well, is just feeling, um, having that freedom of speaking up and just asking for help. That's something I've been trying to normalize and encourage
Yeah,
people to do, because it is important. And the key thing I keep repeating is, if you don't ask for help, you're suffering alone, and you can, you know, it's not going to get any better if you continue to suffer alone.
exactly. And it is keeping it, I know I say it's simple. I guess for me, it is simple talking about your feelings, but I understand for men that can be incredibly hard because they don't know what those feelings are.
Hmm.
But just having that discussion of like, hey, something's not right at the moment. Can I just have 5 minutes of your time? And
Hmm.
just seeing where that conversation goes. And it can open up avenues for them to be able to talk about how they're feeling and start normalizing it.
Yeah.
There's not many male therapists out there in the UK. They're quite hard to find.
Yeah.
So I know it's easier talking to men. If you do find a good one, go for it.
Hmm.
Um, but there's also lots of great female therapists out there as well. If they ever felt they would be able to do that at some point.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel it's the same over here. I haven't come across many male therapists, so I think it's really just personally, my experience can be different from others, but for me, it's really that rewiring that needs to take place from a kind of neurological perspective. But basically, it's reminding myself over and over and over again that there's nothing wrong with me expressing my feelings. And I often get caught in the trap myself where, if I'm in a situation where I'm hurt or I'm feeling like I haven't been heard, I often respond with silence or just keeping it to myself. And again, it's that suffering I choose for myself, of suffering alone. But it's unfortunate because the only person who suffers is me.
Yeah.
And but it's like, it's almost like we're hardwired that way. And just
Hmm.
having those conversations and taking those risks of opening up can change that, and having that community of people that you can go and talk to.
And it's kind of changing habits as well. Like, one client said to me recently about when he brings up feelings to a male colleague, he uses a phrase of "this sounds a bit gay," but,
Hmm.
and then goes on to say how he feels.
Hmm.
And he said, even saying that, why? He said, why do I do that?
Yeah.
And you know, it's really recognizing that that's that culture within men of having to kind of talk about their feelings and feeling like it's a feminist or female
Yeah.
way of doing it, like it's not right or it's not okay.
Hmm.
When actually he doesn't need to say that first phrase. Just saying how he's feeling is okay. it's
Yeah.
it's as simple as that. um I know I keep saying the word simple, and I know it's not that easy for men. I know it's incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But it is just about having those really initial conversations, even just getting to know someone and whether you
Absolutely.
trust them or not.
For sure. Yeah. And avoiding the labeling, like you said earlier, right? When we start labeling things that, oh, this might sound weird or this may sound like
Uh-huh.
this, you've already labeled it in your mind. It's not what the other person's going to think, it's what you're projecting it to be. So
Yeah.
just yeah, I mean, if you just go in with the mindset that this is completely normal, then you don't need to label it or
Exactly.
qualify
I
the
know.
statement. So again, it is easier said than done, because I can personally attest that I do struggle myself, even though I talk about it. I struggle myself, and the only thing I can say, or words of advice I can pass, is continue to remind yourself and stick with it. It's like any bad habit, that you're trying to get rid of. It requires a lot of work and practice, and that's the only way it gets better.
Yeah. And if you don't get the response that you're looking for in the first try, don't let that be the overriding experience every time you have those conversations. You
Hmm.
know, the next time you speak to someone, you may well have a very different experience, and it's reminding yourself of that as well.
Hmm. For sure, for sure. And again, like I want to thank you, Melissa, for coming on here and sharing your
You're
own story.
welcome.
I appreciate it, and thank you for, I mean, all the kind of the wisdom you've shared. I think, I've learned a lot, and I hope others do as well. For people that want to find you on social media or get a hold of you, what's kind of the best way to do that?
The best way would just be to find my Instagram account, which is not another therapist. Because there's so many of us out there, I thought it was a great way of, yeah, finding myself out from the many.
Yeah,
So yeah, you can find me on Instagram that way.
amazing. Well, thank you again, Melissa. I truly
No, thank
appreciate
you.
the time you took.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just gonna hang on, stop the recording, and then we'll